just come for the second show, thank you for braving the cold and everything else to come be with us tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ben Rowan. I'm the programming coordinator with the Calgary Cinematheque. The previous film was pretty heavy. This film coming next is entirely different, except maybe it's still pretty heavy. Our next film tonight is Kuruta Ichipeiji, or A Page of Madness. It's a Japanese silent film from 1926, and it's a highly unique cinematic experience. So for this reason, I feel it deserves a little bit of context setting. As part of our Japanese theater series, it's very interesting in the way that it completely rejects Japanese theatrical tradition, and yet still uses those traditions, particularly the use of no masks towards the end of the film. Surviving Japanese silent films are very rare, mostly for the simple reason that firebombing and nitrate film do not go well together. But A Page of Madness is perhaps one of the most notable films from the silent period in Japan. The early 1920s in Japan was a period of westernization, which influenced all facets of Japanese society. The new predominant style in Japanese theater and film at that time was shingeki, or modern realism, and this style saw the end of practices like onagata, the practice of male actors playing female roles in kabuki theater. And as that practice ended in the theater, so too did it end in the highly kabuki-influenced Japanese film industry. This left former onagata Tenosuke Kinugasa out of a job, and so he entered the film industry as a director, working for 3 years at Makino Productions before deciding to go solo. Purchasing a film camera and building a development lab in his basement, Kinugasa reached out to the new impressionist literary movement, Shinkan Kakua, for assistance in crafting the story for his debut indie film. This literary movement, led by writers Riichi Yokomitsu and Yasunari Kawabata, was a reactionary movement with a focus on stripping away the boundaries of Japanese naturalism and Western realism and focusing on the inner subjective lives of human beings and their emotions. It was an avant-garde modernist movement with ties to surrealism. Kawabata's own writings focused on exploring emotions for the sake of emotion and the beauty of sadness and death. Kinugasa wanted his story to explore the topic of mental illness. In Japan at that time, the common belief was that mental illness was hereditary, even as more modern medicine began to show this was not the case. Kinugasa became interested in the topic after seeing the conditions at a Japanese mental hospital firsthand. The story for the film was written by Yasunari Kawabata, who would later become the first Japanese recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1968, and who would ultimately commit suicide in 1972 after experiencing 2 years' worth of nightmares ever since the failed 1970 coup attempt of his friend, Yukio Mishima, who is the subject of our February 3rd screening. Kawabata's story treatment would be further developed by Kinugasa, Banko Sawada, and Minoru Inuzaka, who is best known as the writer of many of the Zakoichi Chambara films of the 1960s. The project attracted the attention of major Japanese movie star Masao Inoue, who agreed to star in the film for free in order to promote the Shinkan Kakua movement. This, in turn, attracted the attention of the Shochiku Movie Studio, who agreed to provide financial backing, equipment, and sound stages for the film. During this period, Japanese films were mostly based on literary sources, adapting kabuki plays or popular novels. Contemporary critics at the time were pushing for Japanese cinema to develop its own style, tell new stories, and utilize the language of film more than that of theater or literature. Japanese critics of the time believed their home cinema was inferior to Western films, that it was immature and underdeveloped. Theaters at the time were divided between those which showed domestic films and those which showed foreign films, with the latter being the more prestigious theaters. When A Page of Madness was first released, it was promoted as both a melodrama and an art film in the style of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which had been an international hit several years earlier. The marketing also played up the film's humble beginnings as an independent project from an outsider director, and heralded as a new step forward in Japanese art due to Kinugasa's artistic independence from the studios. Never mind that the film had major studio funding, and that despite its humble origin, it ended up costing 20,000 yen at a time when most Japanese films cost about 12,000. The film opened at the Shinjuku Musashinokan, Tokyo's premier high-class foreign film theater, whose screenings were programmed by a committee of top film critics. That A Page of Madness would be shown there was taken as a sign that it was seen as being of equal artistic value to foreign films. The movie itself has significant barriers for audiences to interpret its events. For one thing, it is highly subjective, showing us the inner lives of the characters, many of whom have mental illnesses, and it has a lead character who has strong anxieties that present themselves in the films as visions of his fears and obsessions. In this way, the film is constantly switching from fantasy to reality, and it's often unclear which is which in the nightmare-like editing. Now, while the film was certainly designed to be an avant-garde art film, one aspect of it that makes comprehension of its plot even more difficult to other silent films is its absence of intertitles. At the time, it was something of a matter of pride for silent movie directors to be able to tell their stories with a minimum number of title cards, and Kawabata convinced Kinugasa to drop the few title cards he had included, which explained who the characters were and what their relationships to each other were. Now, in Japan, this was not as much of an issue due to the contemporary practice of the benshi, a live narrator who would explain the story, comment on the action, and voice the characters. The benshi was a tradition brought to film from kabuki, and would be accompanied by live music in the kabuki style. Popular benshi became very famous and were usually signed to exclusive contracts at certain theaters. In many ways, they were the bigger box office draw than the films that they were narrating. A Page of Madness had the famous Musei Tokugawa as its benshi upon its premiere. Today, there are maybe only 4 or 5 benshi left working at Japanese repertory theaters. Despite all of this hullabaloo, the film suffered a mixed critical reaction upon release. It garnered a level of critical attention that was rare for a domestic film at the time. While the response from the avant-garde were positive, calling it the first truly film-like Japanese film, contemporary film critics took the movie to task for being incomprehensible if you saw it without a benshi, which in their eyes made it a failure in the effort to create a language of cinema divorced from literary antecedents. Today, we don't know what that benshi would have said, as these performances were somewhat improvised, using the film's story treatment as a basis. Modern audiences such as us simply have to go without. Unfortunately, the film was not a financial success. It made only 7,500 yen, which put Kinugasa in deep debt with Shochiku Studios. This led to him signing a contract to direct more commercial Jidaigeki films at the studio until his debt was worked off. A Page of Madness was thought to be a lost film for decades, for the same reasons that most Japanese silent films are. And so over the next 45 years, it gained a reputation as a remarkable piece of avant-garde cinema, a mystique which grew partially because no one could see it. In 1971, Kinugasa discovered the film in rice cans in his basement and arranged for it to be re-released to great critical acclaim as a lost masterpiece, with critics calling it one of the most radical and challenging Japanese films ever made. Certainly, it is a film which begs audience interpretation. The last time I watched it with my wife, we came away with very different understandings of what the story was. However, upon comparing the re-released version to Kawabata's published screenplay, it appears that many scenes are missing. And comparing the film's length now with records of the period, about 7 minutes are missing from the running time. Now, while it's possible that this footage was just too damaged from 45 years in a rice can to be salvaged, there also exists the possibility that Kinugasa re-edited his own film to more fit its reputation as experimental and avant-garde. While the film largely consists of dream sequences, flashbacks, delusions, and much blurring of reality and fantasy due to the mental illnesses of the characters, It is noticeable that most, if not all, of the discrepancies between the movie we have today and the published script come from the scenes set in reality, which established a context for the delusions. These seem to have been cut down to the bone in the surviving version, increasing the difficulty of following the plot and increasing the ambiguity of which scenes are real and which are fantasy, leaving much of the film's story and theme up to audience interpretation. With this notorious difficulty in understanding the story, and as we lack a Benshi tonight, I offer this plot synopsis that was used in 1926 to promote the film to give us all something to sort of hold on to as we watch. This is the grim inside of a mental hospital, overwhelmed by dancing, shrieking, howling, and yelling. Here, one pitiful and tragic tale is born, the drama of a sailor who had mistreated his wife, forgot his daughter, and eventually drove his wife insane. After a few years, the sailor, tired of life, returned to his hometown and learned that his wife had been saved by a mental hospital. He became a custodian there to gain access. His daughter had grown up beautifully and was about to marry a young man, but she worried about her insane mother. The father's pain, his uneasy fear, was that his insane wife might destroy their daughter's happiness. Thank you all for coming, and please enjoy Kuruta Ichipeji, A Page of Madness.